Anyway, welcome to class this week. Sorry, I just was running a little bit late today because I just went on a little monologue with my friends here on the class. So we are, I'll just get right into the material to keep us within the 1 hour here. And we're going to look further at the debate, I guess you could say, on emptiness between Tsongkhapa and Gorampa. So thank you for coming. And I hope I'm not trying to present too much material here for everybody because I know it's a little overwhelming. So let's start with the Heart Sutra for our blessing, and we'll do a few mantras before we jump right into the material here. Okay. Homage to the perfection of wisdom, the Blessed Mother. Thus I have heard at one time the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajgir and vast Vulture's mountain together, the great assembly of monks and nuns and a great assembly of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Blessed One was of course absorbed in the concentration of countless aspects of phenomenon called profound illumination. In that time, also Superior Balokshvara, the Bodhisattva, the Great Being, was looking perfectly at the practice of profound perfection of wisdom, looking perfectly also at the five aggregates being empty inherent existence. In the power of Buddha, Venerable Shariputra said to Superior Balokshvara, the Bodhisattva, the Great Being, how should a son of the lineage trained in wishes to gain the practice of profound perfection of wisdom? Thus he spoke, and Superior Balokshvara, the Bodhisattva, the Great Being, replied to Venerable Shariputra as follows. Shariputra, whatever son or daughter of the lineage wishes to gain profound perfection of wisdom should look perfectly like this. Subsequently, looking perfectly and correctly also the five aggregates being empty and inherent existence. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form, and form is not other than emptiness. Likewise, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, like this, all phenomena are emptiness, having no characteristics. They're not produced and do not cease. They have no defilement, no separation from defilement. They have no decrease and no increase. Therefore, Shariputra, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. There is no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mentality, no form, no sound, no smell, no taste, no tactile object, no phenomenon. There is no eye elements and so forth up to a mentality element and also up to no element of consciousness. There is no ignorance and no exhaustion of ignorance and so forth up to no aging and death, no exhaustion of aging and death. Likewise, there is no suffering, origin, cessation, or path, no exalted awareness, no attainment, also no non-attainment. Therefore, Shariputra, because there's no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and abide in the perfection of wisdom. Their minds have no obstructions and no fear. Fasting utterly beyond perversity, they attain the final nirvana. Also, all Buddhas reside perfectly, and 3 times, having relied upon the perfection of wisdom, became manifest, complete Buddhas in the state of unsurpassed, perfect, complete enlightenment. Therefore, the mantra of perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the equal and unequal mantra, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all sufferings, since it's not false, should be known as the truth. The mantra of perfection of wisdom is proclaimed, Tayata, Gata Gata Paragata Par Samgati Bodhisoha. Shariputra, Bodhisattva, great beings, should train the profound perfection of wisdom like this. Then the Blessed One arose from that concentration and said to Sri the Bodhisattva, the great being, that he'd spoken well. Good, O son of the lineage, it's like that. Since it's like that, just as you've revealed in that way, the profound perfection of wisdom should be practiced, and the Tathagatas will also rejoice. When the Blessed One had said this, Venerable Shariputra, Spirit of Balokshvara, the Bodhisattva, the great being, the entire circle of disciples, as well as worldly beings, gods, humans, demigods, and spirits, were delighted and highly praised what had been spoken by the Blessed. So again, just taking a moment sort of take refuge in our hearts here, saying to ourselves, I and all sentient beings, until we achieve enlightenment, go for refuge to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And again, taking refuge in particular in the Dharma jewel. So the Buddha as the example and the teacher, the Sangha as our community, trying to get enlightened, helping us get enlightened, but most of all, the Dharma jewel, which are the teachings themselves, in particular our own inner wisdom, wisdom realizing emptiness that we're cultivating. And again, like Atisha says, always look at Dharma, whatever we're doing. Even today, we're doing all this sort of heavy philosophy and everything else. Everything is therapeutic. It is medicine. It is about curing your suffering. It's not about theology or proving points or making thetic points, science explaining things or whatever. It's all therapeutic. And so this is why the teachings are relative and sometimes seemingly self-contradictory, is because they're different medicines for different people, for different ailments at different times. And so Atisha says that Buddha is the doctor, the Dharma is the medicine, and the Sangha are the nurses and the hospital staff helping the doctor. And guess what? You're the patient. So we can look at whatever we're doing today in that kind of light and really understand refuge on that level. And now setting our intention for bodhicitta, the awakening mind, great compassion and love to all beings. May everything we're doing be put towards the enlightenment of all sentient beings. Everything we do, may we become enlightened, that we become a Buddha to help others achieve that same state. So with all the Buddhas here in front of us, presence of us, and all of our teachers, we can just do 3 Gate mantras on emptiness here. Om Gate
Gate,
Gate
Gate,
Gate Para Samgate Bodhi Soha. Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Soha. Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Soha. Okay, so thank you for coming, and blessings of our teachers here in the Buddhas. We'll sort of dive back into this very brief introduction to 2 great philosopher saints of Tibet, Tsongkhapa and Gorampa. And there are 2 different views, the 2 most popular views on understanding wisdom, realizing emptiness. Sometimes what's known, as you'll see, is what they call Rantong and Shentong, or the idea of emptiness of self, Tsongkhapa's view. Not just his view, this is a view that goes all the way back into Indian and sort of classical Indian Buddhism. And then Shentong, or emptiness of other. And so this is as an idea of emptiness of other. It's from the famous Sakya philosopher Saint Topolpa, who came just before Tsongkhapa in the Dopal, or Nepali border area of Tibet, Western Tibet. And his teachings, and it became a new tradition out of the Sakya tradition called the Jonang tradition, which is really seeing a resurgence nowadays, which is good. They have an amazing set of teachings, particularly on Kalachakra, and Topolpa was a famous Kalachakra teacher, and he said that his view on emptiness came from a detailed study of the Kalachakra Tantra, so he didn't make it up, even though it sounded quite different. And then after that, Taranatha was a famous Jonang teacher. Jesendampa Rinpoche, who is one of my root teachers and sort of a great teacher of our lineage in our Sangha here with Zazip Rinpoche. It's interesting enough, going into Tibetan history, but there are sectarian problems between the Tibetan Gelugpa government during the 5th Dalai Lama and the Jonang school. And so what happened is the Jonang tradition, I don't want to get into it, was sort of ended up being banned for a while. But what was interesting is that the Dalai Lama of Mongolia, the Jesendampas, ended up becoming the head of the Jonang school in its Gelugpified form. So, because he was seen as a reincarnation or an emanation of Taranatha, who's a famous Jonang and Shentong philosopher. So this is why we got a basing transmission from Jesendampa Rinpoche, and Zazip Rinpoche's passed it on, of Kalachakra, which is sort of a simple, unique form of Kalachakra that you get in the Jonang school. So I know people remember getting that initiation with Rinpoche. That's where it comes from. But what Rinpoche was telling us is that all these Jonang monasteries in Amdo on the Mongolian border survived and are seeing a huge resurgence where people are studying there, which is amazing. So there's one, and I always forget his name because my friends keep telling me I've read his book, which makes it even more embarrassing, my old jet-lagged age. But he's a great young Jonang Lama now, giving all sorts of great teachings on Kalachakra, and I would recommend his books. They are fantastic. Okay, so getting into this, so that's sort of the Shentong view. So we can see when we talk about emptiness of other, what does Gorampa mean? Well, that the 2 truths are separate. So when you're in a position or sitting in wisdom or realizing emptiness, that is other than everything else. It is other than conventional reality. There is no conventional reality or sort of deluded ignorance in that state of realizing truth or emptiness. That's why they call it emptiness of other. Okay, so this chapter here, going into it, we're looking at the meanings and definitions of the 2 truths, going a little bit deeper here with what we said. Okay, so from classical Indian Buddhism, we use the term for conventional reality, samvrti. So it's SAMVRTI. So it's one of these things where there's two consonants together. So SAMVRTI, samvrti. Okay, so what this word connotates has a bunch of different meanings, is the idea of ignorance, mutual interdependence, and worldly convention. So there's three kind of meanings, and we'll see the devil's in the details on these meanings, because Tsongkhapa, when he's studying the classical text, looking at this word and these three meanings of the word, which don't necessarily entail each other like in a logical way, he comes out with his version of what this means, and then Gorampa comes up with his version of what samvrti means. Okay, so again, these are the three things. It means ignorance, a mutual interdependence, and worldly conventions here. Okay, so this basically ends up being the idea of samvrti. Understanding the meaning of this word is intertwined with an understanding the scopes and limits of what we're negating or denying, what has to be eliminated in our understanding of truth, ultimate truth. Okay, what is the ignorant mind grasping onto, and what is that? That's the thing, that the object of negation. That's what has to be erased if we're realizing ultimate truth or emptiness here. Okay, so then another thing is the idea of what is samvrti, the nature of ignorance, or what they call a concealer. How is ignorance concealing or hiding the truth kind of from itself? Okay, so in the Prasanapada text from Chandrakirti, the great Buddhist scholar saint and commentator on Nagarjuna, he says that samvrti means entirely obstructing. Ignorance is the concealer because it covers up the suchness of all things. Okay, so, but it also, he says, means interdependence and means worldly conventions. So we can see that Chandrakirti sort of posits those three definitions of samvrti. Okay. It also has the character of expression and express, so that's what is expressing and what is being expressed, consciousness and the objects of consciousness. So it means a whole bunch of different things, that in philosophy, whenever you have a word that means a whole bunch of different things, some of them conflicting, you know you're in trouble. You know you're going to have to spend time really thinking and defining the terms properly or arguing on them. So what Tsongkhapa, first of all, says when he starts dealing with samvrti and the nature of the true truths, is he says that the first definition of samvrti being ignorance is, okay, so it is ignorance because it conceals or obstructs reality. But then this is the clinchers we'll see. This is what Tsongkhapa says that's important. He says, but not all samvrti are obstructors. So not everything we mean by samvrti is obstructors. So those other two definitions, the first one's ignorance, and the other two are mutually independence or interdependence and worldly convention. Ignorance doesn't flow through to those other two definitions either. It's just basically held on the first definition. So concealer ignorance is in a smaller scope than you'd think. We're just holding it kind of in this one little corner here. So, yeah, so even here, so it's the characteristic samvrti can mean expressor and express, consciousness and objects. But okay, so anyway, so Tsongkhapa is sort of, like I said, he's got these bunch of definitions here of samvrti, but he's trying to define what the sort of ignorance part of it means, or what the concealing part of it means. So what Gorampa says, starting off right from the beginning, is he says if the first definition of samvrti is ignorance, that means that's what it is. So the other parts of it, interdependence, conventions, maybe consciousness and its objects, the expressor, the expressed, in other words, language, terms, labels, all of these are ignorance. All of these are concealers. Basically, all of them are wrong. Right? Maybe I should use the term wrong, but in the sense that all of them are false there. So this ends up being the question of ignorance, or the scope of ignorance ends up becoming the real difference between these two thinkers here and the real scope of their work. And it's the implications for the entire system of what it means to be conventional truth. Okay, so Tsongkhapa says that essence reified by ignorant consciousness is an epistemological issue on a strict level. They are primarily conceptual reifications. Empirical essence, I'm just reading my notes here, I'll comment on here in a second. Empirical essences are non-existent, do not have ontological foundation, despite ordinary beings cling to essences. They are not empirical truths. The eradication of ignorance leads to eradication of conceptually reified essences, but not empirical truths themselves. Okay, so getting into this from Zamverti, the first thing that Tsongkhapa says is that what we mean by this is sort of my own commentary on these notes. What we mean by ignorance or a concealer is something our conceptual mind is adding to objects in the world or empirical things in the world. So we have consciousness and as objects, we have experiences. Things are changing, they're impermanent, they're mutually interdependent, their causes and effects are karma. But as we know from having studied Buddhism, our ignorant or deluded mind is adding inherent or true existence to things. This is something we're adding to things. It's something things themselves don't have, right? So what are we adding is this deluded view or wrong view that things exist outside of any relationship to anything else. So in Tibetan, they say things exist, quote unquote, from their own side. In other words, outside of relationships. So this is something our deluded mind is adding to things. So I always say it's like you're putting ketchup over everything. So you've got your chocolate cake, ketchup goes over it. You get your nice latte, ketchup goes in it. Whatever you get your nice sushi, ketchup goes over it. So the point is the ketchup is something you're adding to everything, and what happens? Everything tastes gross. So we have to be able to see the difference between the ketchup and the things themselves, right? So this is something that Tsongkhapa says that the conceptual mind is, but ontologically, or in terms of the nature of things, their own empirical existence, they're fine the way they are. Okay, so in terms of the other two definitions of Samverti, things being worldly conventions, how we label and talk about things, and also how things are interdependent or affect each other through cause and effect or relationships. Those things ontologically are fine, and they stand as in and of themselves. They're okay. This is a huge thing because this is why they call the Gelugpa tradition quasi-realist. It's interesting. In other words, we believe, sort of as Gelugpas, that the conventional world, empirical world, does exist kind of in a virtual way. Not inherently exist, but it has a reality of its own that's not false. Okay, this is a clincher. This is actually really important. Now, Gorampa, of course, on the other hand, what he says, studying Tsongkhapa's work and coming up with his own stuff, is that empirical truths or empirical objects themselves are essence reified by ignorance. There are no conceptually reified essences apart from what are empirically given. So the eradication of ignorance is the eradication of empirical truth. So this is what's interesting, is that basically for Gorampa, empirical things themselves are products of delusion. I know that sounds a little bit weird as a Gelugpa. You've been like studying Gelugpa, so I was like, what? But he basically says, how can we make this division that Tsongkhapa makes between these three senses of Samverti? He says, well, the first definition of Samverti is ignorance, and so basically everything's ignorance. All conventional truths are ignorant. All of our consciousness and its objects are a product of ignorance. They're concealers, they're deluded, they're false posits by the mind. Empirical truths, empirical realities. Anything outside your mind is just a projection of your mind, and it's false. It's like an illusion. It doesn't exist. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So looking at my notes here, essential mode of existence. Okay. Yeah, so I just said here, like, so the idea of concealer ignorance is for Tsongkhapa and Gorampa, that things are devoid of essences or empty of any substantial mode of being, but due to ignorance of ordinary beings that conceptually reify or superimpose onto phenomena an essential mode of existence, unconsciously apply this distorted identities to phenomena, confuse them with true identity. So both of them agree that the problem with sentient beings, what samsara is that we're projecting, quote unquote, true existence onto things and then thinking that that's what they are. The difference for Tsongkhapa is that true existence can be separated out from objects themselves, which are impermanent and a product of karma, and for Gorampa, they can't be. Okay? Now, goes a little bit deeper here. Both of these thinkers now diverge in their treatment of ignorance. Gorampa says Samvrti, in his connotation of ignorance, is responsible for reifying the whole system of empirical truths. There is no cognition that does not reify Samvrti at some time as verifying it. Every cognitive event or perceptual or conceptual event reifies or conceives essence. Therefore, reifies or conceives all cognition, cognized objects as objects of negation. Every cognition is under the influence of ignorance. So that's what's interesting here. We can go in a little bit deeper here. I just want to make sure I can keep, yeah, okay, this is good. We're making good time here. So what you see a big difference is that, I'm going to go at my own thing. What Tsongkhapa says is that when we're looking at the two truths, basically it's any object has these two quality, I don't want to say qualities, kind of like true natures, that it's basically one but two at the same time. This is what Gorampa doesn't like, but basically everything has a conventional nature and an ultimate nature. So I always pick up my watch here, but we can talk about this on a conventional level as being a product of cause and effect or different empirical realities or materials. Going a little bit deeper, we see that we can talk about it in terms of it being wholes and parts. Like I say, this is sort of an object of my mind, but then I go a little bit deeper, wholes and parts. I can divide it up into different ways of conceiving it, what the difference between, like let's say it's straps and the springs inside or whatever. Then at the deepest level of dependent arising, we can talk about how this is an object of my mind in terms of how the concepts and language and words I use to talk about it. Right? So in a conventional nature, that's what this is. On an ultimate nature, we see that it's none of these things, that it's empty, that because it's a dependent arising, it doesn't have any sort of true nature in and of itself. So what Tsongkhapa says is that this one thing has these two natures that penetrate one another or interdependent one another. And it's the two ways of verifying it depend on which stance you want to take. So I can use my empirical mind, my regular sort of conceptual mind, to verify it empirically. In other words, I can, talk about it in everyday language. I can look to see if it has, sort of an empirical nature, this and that. But when I use my ultimate way of verifying it, it sort of disappears into emptiness. Exactly. I hope I'm being a little bit clear with this. So it just depends what level you want to, which perspective you want to look at, right? But they go together because interdependence, you can't have one without the other. So we can use our conceptual mind to actually find things and do our Dharma work in the world. But that only works for conventional realities or empirical truths. We use this different mind, our sort of ultimate mind, our ultimate way of verifying things, to look at things in terms of their emptiness. So how Tsongkhapa basically does that is he, on the conventional level, we call it being truths for the obscured. Things appear to be, like they always say, why conventional reality is somehow a little bit false or deluding, is things appear to be different than their nature. Things appear to exist independent of us, appear to be self-standing, appear to be separate from your mind, just things appear dualistically, but when we look for them, they're not that way. We see that they're interdependent, that they're dependent arisings, and most of all, dependent of my own mind to think and talk about them. Okay, so that's what conventional reality is, and that's how that conventional reality, once we start looking for its real nature, we find that it doesn't have one, and we end up in ultimate reality. Okay, so you can see how conceptuality itself, or the empirical mind itself, can actually lead you into an understanding of emptiness, a deeper ultimate view of reality. Now, Gorampa says it's quite the opposite. Conceptuality itself is deluded. See the difference? Is that what we're, on Gorampa's view, what we're rejecting is the empirical world itself. We're rejecting conventional reality itself. Right? In other words, you see this a lot in different sects of Buddhism, is, quote unquote, let go of your conceptual mind. Get out of concepts. Concepts are wrong. Concepts are deluded. Concepts are misleading you. go into non-conceptual mind, right? You see, it's quite different from a Gelugpa point of view. It's not about getting rid of your conceptual mind, because it's the conceptual mind that leads you into ultimate reality. It's when we're looking for things that we start to see their emptiness. Okay? You see the difference here. And again, I'm not saying one's right, one's wrong. It's going to depend which one you like, which is most helpful for you, right? I just want to show the difference of what it means on the idea of what counts as sort of a verifying cognition for both of these philosophers, both of these thinkers here. Okay, just want to sort of finish up, and we'll leave a little bit of time for questions here. I have some notes here. This Jayanda is a very famous Indian scholar at the time after Chandrakirti. And it's interesting because he's a proto-Gorampa. Most of his thought, it sort of is very similar to Gorampa's thought. And that's where Gorampa gets his source material, which is interesting here. So, like for instance, Jayanda says there's two types of samvrti, which basically mean two types of concealer. And he says the first one is the deluded ignorance that creates samsara, which of course we all know is wrong. But he says the second one is the deluded mind that is responsible for the appearance of the conventional world. So that's what, see, even this Indian master, sort of the classical medieval period, he has sort of almost this Shentong view, is that samsara, because we think that it's inherently existing, is completely wrong and deluded. But conventional reality itself is a form of delusion as well, right? Okay, so let me just try and finish up here, because this is the main thing I wanted you guys to get as the concept here. I don't want to sort of overload too much material here. So yeah, response for seeing the truth. Yeah, I think I've sort of been clear about that one. So another thing is when we talk about so samvrtis, the second definition being mutually interdependent. So Tsongkhapa says mutually independent means all phenomena, all worldly or conventional phenomena. But even technically ultimate phenomena, we can talk about it being mutually interdependent, because of course the two truths go together. Ultimate reality is the ultimate reality of conventional reality. So you can see that interdependence or dependent arising applies to the two truths themselves. So one of the reasons I like Tsongkhapa, I like him very much, but anyway, I think one of my philosophy teachers always taught me one of the big things you always have to do in philosophy is to apply your philosophy to itself. It has to be consistent with itself. And what's interesting is that oftentimes you read philosophers where it's not consistent. They're making claims about things, but when you turn it around and apply the same criteria to what they're doing in their own book, it doesn't work. So that to me is always a little bit of a bell going off. What I like about Tsongkhapa's work, sort of this classical Indian way of looking at the two truths, is it's completely consistent within itself. You can apply it to itself, right? So the two truths themselves are empty and interdependent. That's what's so amazing about it. And the way of investigating the two truths, the way you actually have a path, itself is interdependent and empty. So what you get, a problem I find with Gorampa's view, is you can't apply it to itself, right? So if all concepts and conventions, this is a very cartoon criticism. If he was here right now, I know he'd make me out to be a complete idiot, but I'm just saying you can think about this. If all conventions and conventional reality are false and deluded, what about Gorampa's philosophy itself? What about his methodology? That's all conventions and words and thoughts. Is it wrong? Well, if it's wrong, then it's kind of like the liar's paradox they had first part of 20th century logic, right? This is a big thing in analytic philosophy. Someone who's a compulsive liar tells you, I'm lying. Well, is he lying or is he telling the truth, right? If he's a liar, then technically he's lying, but then he's saying something true. So it was a big thing in the first part of 20th century logic is, how do we ascertain the truth of that statement? Is he lying? Like, is he right or is he wrong, right? Like, how does that make sense as a statement? And it's a similar kind of view with the Shentong philosophy. Now, they end up saying, as you'll see, that the path itself is illogical. It's like Zen. Why it works is because it's crazy, right? Like we have to approach our own craziness with kind of like a crazy path itself, hence crazy wisdom. It's because it's illogical that it can kind of get in your head and untie the knots, right? Whereas the Galupa point of view is like, no, it's very logical. It's like you're crazy. It's a logical thing. It's like you're drowning. We're sending a little helicopter with the little dinghy ring or whatever to pull you out of the ocean. We can actually give you logical instructions how to liberate yourself. And that's what a path is. A path is like a map. A map has to make sense for you to get yourself out of being lost. Right. So that's what Anne Klein was asking the Dalai Lama about this exact thing. And she says, well, is emptiness completely inexpressible, right? Conceptually. In other words, like Gorampa, is it completely, can we talk about it? The Dalai Lama is so sweet. He says, it's not that inexpressible. It's like a great quote, which I think is funny, right? So how is it like we use that image of dependent arising? Like that works, right? We can talk about a flower growing and say, hey, this is a good example of emptiness. Is it emptiness? Well, no, it's not. It's a conventional reality, but we get at emptiness in through that analogy. So I don't want to give. I never ever want to give a cartoon or a dummy version of someone like Goran because it's very subtle what he's saying. He's not completely wrong or whatever. I want to do justice to what he is saying. But what I'm saying is just like the author here, Sonam Thakchoe, he used to be a Galupa monk. So he said, I hate to say it, but he's like, my bias is going to come out in this book a little bit that I do favor Tsongkhapa's view on emptiness. So anyway, so that's why Tsongkhapa's view of interdependence applies to the two truths themselves. So whereas Gorampa says ultimate truth is ontologically free from the imperfections of empirical truth, like being conditioned, false, deceptive, interdependent. It is ontologically transcendent and absolute. It is not relative. It is not a semvirti. So that's Gorampa's view of sort of what interdependence means. Interdependence is an idea of it being false or illusory. It's an illusion, and so illusions are false. They're wrong. It's like a magic trick. So it can't possibly be true. Truth has to be something different than that. Samvirti as worldly conventions. So of course, this is the last definition, then I'll finish right here for the class here. So the last thing is Samvirti means is the idea of worldly conventions. So what do we mean? This I could sit here and talk for weeks, and of course I'm not going to. But the idea of what is a convention, like when we get to philosophy of language, it's fascinating. Even in the last 100 years of Western philosophy, analytic philosophy, it's a huge issue. Because what you got, my favorite philosopher, who I think is an emanation of Tsongkhapa, Ludwig Wittgenstein, deals with this in his philosophy, is the idea of how do things make sense? How are meanings generated? And of course, they're generated through rules. We can talk about language being a system of rules. And so he's one of the first famous guys in ordinary language philosophy, the idea that the meaning of a term or a meaning of a word is its use. How do we know what we mean? How do we use words? How do we understand concepts? Well, how we're using them in our daily involvements in the world, right? So what are these rules? These are quote unquote conventions, right? So David Kellogg, who's one of the most famous American philosophers, wrote a whole book on this in the 1960s called Conventions, right? So because this ends up being a big issue, is what you'll see is there's problems with this view. So Saul Kripke, who's still alive, he's probably one of the last sort of great, sort of from that generation, American philosophers. He was teaching university when he was like 18 years old. Like he's an absolute whiz kid and a genius logician. Philosophy of language. He wrote a famous book on Wittgenstein in the early 80s, looking at this precise problem with conventions. This is where you're thinking, why am I going on about this? Because this is basically the thing that Gorampa ends up saying. So what Saul Kripke found, it has been a big debate. I mean, when I was in school, it had just come out, 10 years prior, and everyone was talking about it, is Saul Kripke, the dummy version of the argument is basically if everything is a rule, how do we know how to follow a rule, right? Well, you'd probably need another rule to follow a rule, right? And so is this an infinite regress of rules? If there's an infinite regress of rules, then nothing means anything. Now, so everyone jumped on this. You run around and have big arguments on this, but he's a brilliant mathematician, and he said what's interesting is when you're doing high level math or geometry or any of these things, you're following rules, but how do you know how to follow them? And what you see, like Glenn Gould was one of my favorite classical musicians, and maybe because he's weird like me, but I remember at CBC during on they had maybe like a little bit of a documentary on him. It was maybe the anniversary of Glenn Gould's death years ago or something. But they had this one guy because of course he's famous. Like when I'm in Japan, there's all posters of him everywhere. Everyone loves Glenn Gould even still. But as an Italian director came and made a documentary on him. And I don't know if you know, Glenn Gould's a real weird guy, very autistic, but he never, his life was basically his apartment, his studio in Don Mills, and Fran's, that 24-hour breakfast place on Yonge and Eglinton. You go there, you have the same thing every day, which is, what was it? I think scrambled eggs and ketchup or something. But anyway, and when you went to his house, he had that really nice condo around Yonge and, or is it St. Clair and Yonge? I think maybe it's St. No, I think it is St. Clair. I think it's just. I'm trying to remember in my mind where he used to live. That was my old neighborhood in Toronto. So you go to his condo there, just like this Italian guy did. He came in from Italy, comes to see him in the early '80s, and you come into his house and there's nothing to eat. So all you'd ever get from Glenn Gould is arrowroot cookies. That's all we had in the house. And so you come for dinner or whatever, and you get arrowroot cookies and a glass of milk. So this guy, that was his dinner. He got in from a long flight from Italy. He just has some arrowroot cookies. And then Glenn Gould says, well, do you want me to take you to my studio at the Eden Center downtown? We can play music. Oh my God, of course. So he goes down there, got the whole studio. It's like an auditorium. And this guy's sitting in the first row. And from heart, from memory, for like 6 or 8 hours straight, Glenn Gould just plays music. Had it all memorized, all like Mozart, Beethoven, or something. But here's what's interesting, why I'm going with this. Oh my God, what's this I don't know about? Is he say, what do you want to hear? Do you want to hear Beethoven's Eroica? And he say, yeah, do it. And plays it perfect. And then Glenn Gould say, but you can also play it this way. It'll be completely different. You can also play it this way. So he'd play each thing that you know 2 or 3 different times based on the sheet music. And the point is, you can play it that way. Which way do you play it? How do you know which way to play it? You see, it's kind of interesting, right? So this is the idea of how do you know how to apply a rule? So Saul Kripke was saying that to about Wittgenstein. When you're doing math or anything, how do I know how to continue? You just quote unquote know, but how do you know? Maybe you don't know. So where I'm going with this is that at the end of the day, what's conventional reality? When we talk about conventions, they're just rules. So we need rules to talk and to conceive of things. So Tsongkhapa says, you can trust those rules because that's all we have. That's how we have a path. That's how things work. Do they have a nature? No. Do we find them when we look for them? No. Are they grounded? Absolutely not. But like Chandrakirti, Tsongkhapa says, that's why they work. It's because they don't have a nature. We can create things, we can come to agreements because there's no nature. But Gorampa says they have to be wrong if they're not grounded. It's an infinite regress. So that's precisely why they're an illusion and you can't take them seriously. That's why normal reality, when I look for it, is just this fake magic show like The Matrix. I can't take it seriously. So you see how it's half empty or half full. Tsongkhapa basically says, no, it's because it's empty, it has no ground. We can work with it. We can create. We can get enlightened. And Gorampa's like, no, because it's like that, we have to reject it entirely. Don't believe anything your mind posits. It's all fake. See the difference based on what a convention is? That's really, again, you see, they're both kind of right. I mean, it's not like one's like a dummy. Like they're both got really, really good points. But what Tsongkhapa would say to Gorampa if they were there together, he was dead the time Gorampa was around, but if you put them all in the same room, he'd always say, okay, let's say everything, you reject everything. What are people supposed to do? How do you teach them Dharma? If even that's fake, right? And then Gorampa would say, well, that's the whole point. It's like Zen, let it all, burn it all down. And then people are just in ultimate truth. right? It's like a koan, what was your face before you were born or something. You see, it's in a lot of ways it's kind of like a different path, right? But this is important. I'll just say one last thing. One of my big heroes, Gundan Chögyam, that Rinpoche talks about a lot about. He was a monk, Gelugpa monk. He was actually from a Nyingma family, like a Tulku, and is considered one of the great thinkers in Tibet in the 20th century. And he's amazing. I have his books. He basically ran away from Tibet as a young monk, went to India, learned English, traveled everywhere, was just incredible. Wrote one of the first great books on Tibetan history, translated the Kama Sutra into Tibetan. It's called Tibetan Arts of Love. Was a master artist, incredible. And it's very sad. He right when World War II broke out, the American embassy in India was trying to get him to come to Seattle, University of Washington, to teach there. And they always say if he had taught there, everything Tibetan Buddhism in the world would have been different because he was such a genius and he would have been able to translate a lot of texts. Pearl Harbor happened, borders closed, he was stuck in India. Then I'm not going to get into it because it's typical Tibetan government politics. There are people in Tibetan government that were his ex-students that for some reason had an issue with him. They invited him back to Tibet to give a talk, and when he came, they arrested and threw him in jail. Like government corruption. So when the Chinese invaded, they let him out of jail in the 1950s, but he was a huge alcoholic and he died after. It's very, very sad. Donald Lopez is that great Buddhist professor. He's written a lot of Gundan Chögyam. But Gundan Chögyam takes Gorampa's view and just runs with it. He has a book called The Madman's Middle Way, criticizing Tsongkhapa's view of emptiness. And this is what got him into trouble because he was a Gelugpa monk. And they had this, I can't remember his teacher. His teacher's a very famous geshe, and they'd have these huge screaming matches, kind of arguments in class on this issue. But Gendon Chögyam, when you read his poetry, he's an amazing poet. I have a book of his poetry. This is one of the huge things he says, is you have to reject conventional reality as fake, empirical reality. He always says, how can you believe any of this? It's so crazy. How can you take anything seriously in this world? It's crazy. That's what he's always saying in his poetry, right? So he's the new kind of Gorampa of this time, right? It's kind of interesting. And then Trijang Rinpoche's heart student, his only Semi Rinpoche, wrote a big criticism of The Madman's Been Away, again in Schuffel's book, from Tsongkhapa's point of view. And yeah, Semi Rinpoche is one of the great stories entries. Basically, I've been there, done this, just more of Gorampa stuff. You know what it's like. These guys are always denying everything, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Don't take it too seriously. Anyway, there you go. That's all I want to say today. Does anyone have, I know probably some big questions. Does anyone have any comments or questions? I just kind of want you guys to marinate in this and think about it. But any comments? I know, Maureen, you said that excellent question in email there, which is, we'll get into this, but you can see huge issues like, if the two truths are separate, how would a Buddha and ultimate truth be able to relate to you in conventional reality? Well, think about that from Gorampa's point of view. How's that possible? We have, in the Gelugpa tradition, conventional reality does mean something. So that's how Buddhas communicate with you, is through language. They teach you. This is why in the old days, I remember Geshe Mike Roach saying this, is that Tibetans see language as a magical thing. So you never, in the old days, you wouldn't even throw a newspaper in the garbage. That you have to burn it, like even old books. Never step on a piece of paper that has language on it. Why? Language is sacred. Why? It's the only way Buddhists can get through to you. They're an ultimate, like this Pure Land, the only thing they have to pull you up into that Pure Land is language. So, oh my God, that's how special this is. I don't want to disrespect it. Is that interesting?
Matthew?
Yeah.
This isn't a question.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that this whole thing, which we've been studying for quite a while now,
Yeah.
I've had this very subtle underlying agitation
Mm.
because it is so complex, and I feel at peace. I want to just thank you for that incredible clarification of all of that. And whatever I'm studying or reading now, I'm just going to be quite at peace with it. And it's all interesting and it's important, but I'm feeling like I'm getting it, what you're saying from
Good.
me.
Well, I hope so. And again, like if I end up confusing people and getting people upset, actually, whatever, that I have failed. And again, I'll suffer for it karmically. But like I said, if this is helpful and that's good, this is great. And like I said, well, the next course after this, kind of the last sort of one I really want to teach on sutra, unless people want to keep going with stuff, will be sort of more of a clarification of Tsongkhapa's point of view. And our great teacher, Lama Ben Christian, has been working on that class as well. So I defer you to his classes, which are just amazing. But we'll go a little bit more deeper. So even at the end of this class, if you're a little bit confused, that'll get ironed out in the next few months too, with some more stuff that we're doing. But again, I felt it important to teach this kind of stuff, Gorampa stuff, and Shentong things, which are interesting. And like I say, I like teaching alternate point of views because again, it makes you think, opens things up. You know. Anything else before we go? You good? Okay, how about that then? How about we conclude for today? I'm going to be at home doing retreat a little bit before I go back to work and go back to my flying. But I'll do another live class next week, which is good. So I'll prepare um, the class and stuff. So we'll do about, I think I've got about 3 more classes, and then we'll have a big question and answer discussion at the end of it. I'll try and keep them, like you can see, in some ways some of the same things are going to be repeated a little bit, so it doesn't have to be that much as long as you're getting the general picture. We've got a class on language and concepts next week. Then there's how to get enlightened, and then what's enlightenment like. Like at the end of the day, what Tsongkhapa says, what does a Buddha see? What's it like to be a Buddha? Gorampa's like, well, what's it like to be a Buddha? And what's interesting is both of them have different views of what it's like to be a Buddha. Like, what does a Buddha see when you're a Buddha? It's kind of interesting. So I'd like to sort of end the course on that little talk in a few weeks. Okay, so let's take a moment to dedicate for, again, the welfare of all sentient beings. We can just, all of our studies here and our discussion, may this be put karmically towards us realizing emptiness, more study, more meditation, but most of all, just may it be towards the liberation of all sentient beings. The blessings of all holy beings, truth of karma, power of our pure spirit intention, bodhicitta, may we all get enlightened. Okay, thank you. I'll just press stop here.